The first thing the HOA noticed about my cabin was the solar panels. Not the fact that the place had been sitting quietly in the woods for nearly 20 years. Not the wildlife trail that ran behind the property. Not the fact that the nearest paved road was half a mile away.
No.
What caught their attention was the 3 solar panels on my roof. I found out about it through a letter taped to my front door, which was impressive considering my cabin is technically outside the neighborhood. The envelope had the familiar logo of Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association printed across the top like it was some kind of official government agency. Inside was a violation notice. Bold heading. All caps. Unauthorized structural modifications. I read the letter twice. Apparently, someone from the HOA had spotted the panels while driving through the back access road and reported them as unapproved exterior alterations. The letter demanded I remove them or submit a compliance application within 10 days. And if I didn't, there would be daily fines. I stood there in the doorway of my off-grid cabin staring at the page. The solar panels had been installed 5 years earlier, long before Pine Ridge Estates had even finished building the last phase of their neighborhood. But developers have a funny habit of expanding their boundaries on paper once houses start selling. Somewhere along the line, my quiet little piece of forest had apparently ended up inside their community oversight zone. At least according to the HOA, which was news to me. My cabin sat on 5 acres of wooded land. No city utilities. No sewer lines. No cable. Just a gravel driveway, a rainwater tank, and enough solar power to run the lights and a small fridge. That was the whole point. I didn't buy the place to be part of a neighborhood. I bought it to avoid neighborhoods. Still, I figured this was probably just a mistake. So that afternoon I drove down to the Pine Ridge Estates clubhouse. The place looked exactly how you'd expect an HOA office to look. Neatly trimmed landscaping, white columns, a sign out front that said Community Management Office. Inside sat a woman at the reception desk.
Clipboard.
Professional smile. The whole thing. "Can I help you?" she asked. I set the violation letter on the counter. "I think you guys made a mistake." She glanced at it. "Oh yes," she said casually. "That's from the Architectural Compliance Department. My cabin isn't part of your HOA." She clicked a few things on her computer, then turned the monitor slightly toward me. A neighborhood map filled the screen. And there it was. A thick red boundary line drawn around Pine Ridge Estates. The problem was, my property was barely inside it. Just the very corner. Which meant someone had technically included my land when the development filed its final paperwork. "We oversee properties within that boundary," she explained. "My place existed before the neighborhood." She nodded politely. "That doesn't exempt it from architectural guidelines." I laughed once. "You're telling me my off-grid cabin needs HOA approval for solar panels?" "Correct. And if I don't comply?" She slid a printed sheet across the desk. "Fine schedule. $100 per day after the 10-day notice period." It was the kind of document designed to look intimidating. Lots of bold text. Lots of legal language. But something about it didn't sit right with me. Mostly because I'd bought that land with a very specific type of property agreement. One that made off-grid living possible in the first place. Still, I kept my voice calm. "Who runs the HOA management company?" I asked. She looked slightly confused. "Why?" "Just curious." She checked another document. "Our association is managed by Summit Community Management Group." I nodded slowly. Got it. Because right at that moment something in the back of my mind clicked. The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. And, if I was remembering correctly, the company managing Pine Ridge Estates had a corporate parent. One that had recently purchased a bunch of regional management firms, including one I'd been dealing with professionally for years. I folded the violation letter and slipped it back into the envelope. "Well," I said, "thanks for explaining everything." "You're welcome," she replied cheerfully. "Just make sure you submit the compliance form within 10 days. I nodded, then walked out to my truck. Because the funny thing about that solar panel fine wasn't the $100 per day. It was the management company behind it. And once I confirmed what I suspected, the people running that HOA were about to realize they'd just find someone who, technically, was their boss. The drive back to the cabin took about 20 minutes. Gravel road, tall pines, spotty cell service. Exactly the kind of place people choose when they want to be left alone. By the time I reached the driveway, the sun was starting to dip behind the ridge. The solar panels on the roof were catching the last bit of light, quietly doing what they'd been doing for 5 years without bothering anyone. I parked the truck and pulled out my phone. There was one thing I needed to confirm before I reacted to that violation notice. The name the receptionist had mentioned. Summit Community Management Group. I opened my email and searched the name. It took about 3 seconds for the results to appear. Because 6 months earlier, my company had completed a major acquisition. A regional consolidation of several property management firms across 3 states. The goal was simple: build a larger portfolio of community management services under one corporate umbrella. At the time, I hadn't paid much attention to the individual companies involved. I handled the finance side of the deal. The operational details were someone else's department. But one of the companies on that list was Summit Community Management, which meant something very interesting. Technically speaking, Summit was now a subsidiary. And the parent company that owned it? Well, I was one of the majority partners. Not a middle manager. Not some distant investor. One of the people who actually signed off on the acquisition. In other words, the HOA management company that had just threatened me with daily fines worked for a company that I partially owned. I leaned back in the driver's seat and laughed. Not loudly. Just the quiet kind of laugh that happens when a situation suddenly flips upside down. Now, to be fair, I wasn't their direct supervisor. Corporate structures don't really work like that. But the executive board of our parent company absolutely had authority over Summit's regional operations, which meant if I wanted to, I could make one phone call and have someone start asking questions about Pine Ridge Estates. Still, I wasn't interested in throwing my weight around right away. I've learned something over the years about HOA disputes. The best move is rarely the first one. So instead of calling anyone, I walked up to the cabin porch and sat down with a cold drink. The forest was quiet, wind moving through the trees, a hawk circling somewhere above the ridge. The kind of evening you buy off-grid land for, and the kind of peace an HOA letter tends to ruin. I unfolded the violation notice again. Unauthorized structural modifications. Solar panels. Apparently, those 3 panels on my roof were offensive enough to warrant a $100 per day fine, which would start in about 9 days. The letter included instructions to submit an architectural compliance application, forms, drawings, material specifications, photos, the whole bureaucratic package, all for something that had been installed half a decade earlier. And here was the funny part. The HOA board probably had no idea my cabin even existed until someone drove down the service road and spotted the panels. Which meant this entire situation started with one person deciding to enforce a rule without checking the history of the property. Classic HOA move. But if they were going to treat my cabin like part of their neighborhood, then I figured I might as well play along. So the next morning, I filled out the compliance application exactly like they requested. Project description. Solar energy installation for off-grid power. Installation date: 5 years prior. Purpose: primary electrical supply for remote residents. Then I attached photos of the panels. 3 simple units mounted on the roof. Nothing flashy. Nothing oversized. Just enough to keep the lights on and charge a few batteries. At the bottom of the form, there was a section labeled Additional Comments. I stared at that blank space for a moment. Then I wrote one sentence. Please confirm that Pine Ridge Estates HOA has legal authority to enforce architectural compliance on pre-existing off-grid properties within the development boundary. Simple. Direct. And a question they probably hadn't considered. I scanned the form and emailed it back to the address listed on the violation notice. Then I waited. Because whether the HOA realized it or not, they had just started a conversation that was going to reach far higher up their management chain than they expected. And in about 30 days, someone from Summit Community Management was going to discover something extremely awkward about the homeowner they were trying to fine. The HOA responded faster than I expected. 2 days after I sent the compliance application, another email landed in my inbox. Subject line: Architectural Review Decision, Pine Ridge Estates. I opened it while sitting at the small kitchen table in my cabin. The message was short and not particularly friendly. After reviewing my submission, the HOA Architectural Committee had determined that the solar panels did not comply with community design standards. Apparently, Pine Ridge Estates required all rooftop equipment to be visually minimized from neighboring properties. Which was funny, considering the nearest house to my cabin was half a mile away. The email concluded with a reminder that my 10-day compliance deadline remained in effect. If the panels were not removed or modified, daily fines of $100 per day would begin immediately. I read the message twice. Then I looked out the window toward the roof, where the panels were quietly charging my battery bank like they always had. The forest didn't care about HOA rules. Neither did the deer wandering through the clearing. Still, the HOA clearly thought they had authority here, and they were about to test that assumption. I decided it was time to confirm one more thing. So that afternoon, I opened my laptop and logged into our corporate directory. Our parent company had a pretty straightforward structure. Regional management firms like Summit Community Management handled day-to-day HOA operations. Those firms reported up through a regional director, and that regional director ultimately reported to the executive board, which was where I came in. I scrolled through the list until I found Summit's current leadership. Regional Director, Mark Ellison. Operations Manager, Lydia Patel. Both names looked vaguely familiar from quarterly reports. I clicked Mark Ellison's profile and checked the contact information. Direct office line. Corporate email. All still active. Perfect. Now, I could have called him right then and explained the situation. But where's the fun in that? Instead, I waited. Because according to the HOA's timeline, the 10-day deadline would expire the following week, which meant the fines would officially begin. And once the fines started, the management company would become much more involved. That's when the situation would get interesting. Sure enough, 10 days later, another letter appeared at my cabin door. This one had a bright orange header. Final notice. Daily fines in effect. The document listed the violation again. Unauthorized solar installation. Fine amount, $100 per day. Balance due, $100. I almost admired the confidence. Some HOA board somewhere had officially decided they could charge my off-grid cabin rent for sunlight. I poured a cup of coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the morning fog lift over the trees. Then I pulled out my phone. Time for that phone call. Mark Ellison answered on the third ring. Summit Community Management, this is Mark. Hey Mark, I said. This is Daniel Harper. There was a pause. A very noticeable pause. Because Daniel Harper wasn't just some random homeowner name in our company database. It was listed on the executive board roster. Mr. Harper, he said carefully. Yep. I wasn't expecting your call. I imagine not. Another pause. What can I help you with? I leaned back in the porch chair. Well, I said, one of the HOAs your team manages just fined my off-grid cabin for solar panels. Silence. Then a confused laugh. I'm sorry, what? Pine Ridge Estates, I said. They've started charging me $100 a day. The silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds this time. I could practically hear Mark pulling up records on his computer. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Let me make sure I understand, he said slowly. You're saying Pine Ridge Estates HOA is issuing violation fines against you? That's right. Another pause. Then a quiet exhale. Well, he said, that's definitely something we should look into. I smiled. Yeah, I said. I think so too. Because in about 5 minutes, Mark Ellison was going to realize something the Pine Ridge HOA board hadn't bothered to check. The homeowner they were threatening with daily fines was technically one of the people responsible for their management company's entire regional budget. And when that realization hit, the next 30 days were going to get very interesting. Mark called me back the next morning, earlier than I expected. I was still on the porch drinking coffee when my phone buzzed. Daniel, he said the moment I answered, I've been reviewing the Pine Ridge situation. That was fast. Well, he replied carefully, once I realized the homeowner involved was you, it moved to the top of my list. I chuckled. Fair enough. There was a pause while he pulled up whatever file he was looking at. So, here's the issue, he continued. The HOA board at Pine Ridge Estates recently decided to do a neighborhood compliance sweep. They've been issuing violations for exterior changes they think weren't approved. That explains the solar panel problem.
Yes.
But what they didn't do, Mark added, was verify the property history. Now that part didn't surprise me. HOA boards often assume every property inside their map boundaries falls under the same rules. But older properties can be different. Easements, pre-development exemptions, grandfather clauses, all kinds of things that change how enforcement works. Did you check the original land records?
I asked.
I did. And another pause. Well, your cabin property predates the entire Pine Ridge development. Exactly. Which means the architectural guidelines don't automatically apply unless the property owner signed the HOA covenant. I leaned back in the chair. And I definitely didn't. No, Mark said. You didn't. In fact, according to the documents he'd just pulled, my 5-acre parcel had been part of an older rural land division years before the developer built the surrounding subdivision. When Pine Ridge Estates filed their neighborhood map with the county, my land had technically fallen inside the outer boundary. But because the cabin property never joined the HOA covenant, they couldn't legally enforce their architectural rules on it, which meant the solar panel fines. Completely unenforceable. Mark sighed. I'm guessing the board didn't realize that. Probably not. And the management office didn't catch it either. Also probably not. The funny thing about HOAs is that the volunteers on the board often assume the management company double-checks things. And the management company often assumes the board already verified the details. Sometimes that leads to situations exactly like this. Mark cleared his throat. So here's what I'm going to do, he said. I'm sending a notice to the Pine Ridge Board this afternoon explaining that your property is not subject to their architectural compliance rules. Sounds reasonable. And we'll cancel the violation immediately. That part didn't surprise me either. But what happened next did. Because Mark wasn't finished. There's another issue we need to address, he said. Oh. The board issued fines without confirming covenant authority. Meaning they tried to enforce HOA rules on a non-member property. I could already hear where this was going. That's not ideal, I said. No, Mark replied. It's actually a liability problem. HOA management companies take that kind of thing seriously. If a board tries to enforce rules where it has no legal authority, the management company can end up dragged into the dispute, which is exactly what Summit wanted to avoid. So we'll be reviewing Pine Ridge's compliance procedures, he continued. That sounds thorough. We'll also be scheduling a training session with the board about property authority and enforcement limits. I smiled slightly. So my solar panels are safe? Yes. And the fines? Cancelled. Then Mark added one last thing. Oh, and Daniel? Yeah. I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention the corporate ownership part to the board. I laughed.
Don't worry.
I wasn't planning to, because honestly, the best part of this whole situation wasn't that I could have pulled rank. It was that I didn't need to. The rules handled that on their own. Still, later that afternoon, I received one more email. This one came directly from the Pine Ridge Estates HOA. Subject line: Violation Notice Withdrawal. The message was brief. After further review, the board had determined that my property was not subject to the architectural guidelines of Pine Ridge Estates. The solar panel violation had been removed. All fines canceled. Case closed. I sat on the porch and looked up at the roof. The 3 solar panels were still quietly soaking up sunlight just like they had every day for the past 5 years. The forest didn't care about HOA rules. And, apparently, neither did the legal paperwork that existed long before Pine Ridge Estates ever showed up. But the real twist happened about a week later. Because that's when I got another call from Mark. And this time, he had a favor to ask. About a week after the fines disappeared, Mark called again. This time he sounded slightly less formal.
Hey Daniel, he said.
Got a minute?
Sure.
I wanted to update you on the Pine Ridge situation. I leaned back in the porch chair and watched the sunlight bounce off the solar panels on the roof. Everything resolved? Yes and no, he replied. The violation is gone, obviously. But the board had a lot of questions after we explained the covenant issue. I can imagine. According to Mark, the HOA board had been pretty surprised to learn that one of the properties inside their boundary line wasn't actually part of the association. Apparently, they'd assumed every parcel on the map followed the same rules, which is a very common HOA mistake. So they're adjusting their enforcement procedures, Mark said. That's good. Yeah, but they also realized something else. What's that? Your property sits right in the middle of the wooded ridge behind Phase 3. That's accurate. And they've been trying to figure out who owns that land for months. I smiled slightly. Now they know. Exactly. Because the truth is, Pine Ridge Estates had grown quickly. New houses.
New streets.
More residents every year. But one thing the developer never built was a proper access trail through the ridge behind the neighborhood. My property sat right where that trail would naturally run. And apparently, the HOA had been discussing possible hiking paths or maintenance routes through that area. Mark continued. They were wondering if you'd ever consider allowing limited access for a trail connection. I laughed quietly. Interesting timing. I figured you might say that. Now, to be clear, they weren't demanding anything. They couldn't. My land wasn't part of the HOA. But they were curious whether some kind of voluntary agreement might be possible. I thought about it for a moment, then looked around at the trees surrounding the cabin. One of the reasons I bought this place was privacy.
Peace.
Quiet. But a narrow walking trail along the far edge of 5 acres wasn't exactly a disaster, especially if it helped prevent future HOA misunderstandings. So, what are they proposing? I asked. Just a simple easement for a marked trail. Nothing near the cabin itself. And what would I get out of it? Mark chuckled. I had a feeling you'd ask that. Apparently, the HOA board had already discussed that part too. Because if I agreed to a trail easement, they were willing to formally recognize the cabin property as independent land outside the HOA jurisdiction. In writing, filed with the county.
Permanent.
Which meant no future boards could suddenly decide my solar panels violated their aesthetic standards again. I took a slow sip of coffee. Not a bad deal. A tiny trail at the edge of the property in exchange for permanent legal clarity. Plus, it would probably stop the HOA from ever bothering me again. All right, I said. I'm open to discussing it. Good, Mark replied. I'll let them know. And that's how the situation ended. The solar panels stayed. The fines vanished. And the HOA that once tried to charge me $100 a day for sunlight ended up negotiating with me like a normal neighbor instead of an authority figure. A few months later, the trail agreement was finalized. A narrow walking path now runs along the far edge of the ridge. Far enough away that I barely notice it. Sometimes hikers pass through. Most of them never even see the cabin. And the HOA? They leave my property alone. No violation letters. No solar panel complaints. No surprise fines taped to the door. Because somewhere in the Pine Ridge HOA meeting minutes, there's now a line that probably gets repeated whenever someone suggests enforcing rules on my land. It probably goes something like this. Let's double-check the property records first. After all, you never know when the quiet off-grid cabin owner might also happen to be connected to the company managing your HOA.